Good evening, Charles. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's my pleasure to be introducing you. For those of you watching that don't know me, my name is Mira Henry. I'm part of the design faculty here at SCI-Arc. I'm also the faculty host for a multi-day workshop with Charles Davis, which we're kicking off now with this public lecture. And as a reminder to all the students and faculty, the workshops are from 10 to 1 Thursday and Friday, tomorrow and the next day. They're open to all, and an email was sent with all the links today. For many of us, Charles, this has been a highly anticipated event. We were planning on having you come and do a workshop on race and architecture last spring here in person at school. And at that time, your very beautiful book, Building Character, Racial Politics, Modern Architectural Style, had just been released. And your other book, Race and Modern Architecture, A Critical History from the Enlightenment to the Present, which you edited with Irene Cheng and Mabel O. Wilson, that was not yet in circulation. The pandemic hit, we had to postpone the event. And as we know, many things have changed since that time, especially as it relates to public conversations around race in America. And we now find ourselves in a heightened moment. There is a broad and public acknowledgement of systemic racism in our country and by extension in our discipline. I pre-ordered my copy of Race and Modern Architecture in March. I received it in June. I think to receive this book, like many, while protests were in full swing, was really powerful. And while timely, the reality is that you have been doing this for a long time. You've been developing this work for a long time. Your contributions in historiography, in pedagogy, and thinking on Black phenomenology have touched many of us before this moment. And now, at this turn, it is exciting to witness your impact on many, many more minds. Charles, like many watching, I hold deep gratitude for the work that you do, has been an ideological beacon. And we all look forward to your lecture tonight and the exchange of ideas that will unfold over the next 2 days. With that, I would like to introduce Charles L. Davis II. He is a designer and architectural historian and cultural critic at the School of Architecture and Planning at SUNY Buffalo, where he teaches design studios and courses in history and theory. He received a PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and MArch from SUNY Buffalo. His academic research examines the racial discourses of modern architectural style debates and its long-term effects on the cultural biases of contemporary practice. His book, as I mentioned, Building Character, the Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style, traces the historical integrations of race and style theory in paradigms of, quote, architectural organicism, or strategies of design that personified buildings to mirror the essential characteristics of the populations they served. He's also co-editor of Race and Modern Architecture, Cultural as Critical History from the Enlightenment to the Present, which challenges designers to write race back into architectural history. Davis also manages an academic blog, Race and Architecture, and an experimental design practice, Studio DASP, Design as Social Praxis, which expands the ways architecture serves as a tool for mediating social needs. His work has been exhibited in galleries in New York and North Carolina. Welcome, Charles.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Mira. I'd like to thank Hernan and the SCI-Arc community for coming and listening to this lecture. It's a pleasure for me to speak to you today about my work, particularly because, as was mentioned, we're sort of in a moment of reflection and hopefully inflection, where we're able to think about where we are as a discipline, think about what our needs are, and to rethink the types of communities that we want to be building as we're doing this process. So I'm hoping to share some work with you that might help you in that process. And I'm looking forward very much to the back and forth that comes with the workshops that will happen on Thursday and Friday. So I'm going to share with you guys a presentation of this work, just so that we can look at it collectively. And I'll try and sort of take you on the path that I've been going on for the last 10 or 15 years to come to this, state that I'm in now, where I can present to you this idea of American architecture as a settler colonial project, which is really the result of thinking about race and architecture in many different forms from the contemporary moment and moving back backward in time. So I want to start with this image today. And this is an image I am showing because, at least in my education and in my conversations with design faculty and those who teach in professional schools of architecture, this is what we tend to think of when we think of race and architecture. We think of social housing or public housing. We think of low-income communities. We think of what is really the material product of the racial politics of the nation writ large. And generally, we tend to stop thinking about race and architecture there. And what I like to point out is that there's a bit of a categorical error when we do this. When we look at this particular image or images like this, and we think that these buildings are racialized, what we're really doing is we're looking at the presence of the non-white body, and usually the Black body, as the bearer of the representational bearer of where it is that we think race occurs within architecture. And at least for me, over the last decade or so, I've been learning about the ways that all architecture is racialized, just like all physical context, the spatial context within the United States are racialized, and finding ways of articulating what that racialization means. It means not relying on the Black body per se, but looking into architectural discourse to understand where it is that these racial ideas have been embedded within the ways that we think about form. And so I'm going to take you through the trajectory that led me to the book Building Character, the racial politics of modern architectural style, to think about the ways that just a singular set of case studies, first beginning in Western Europe, then moving to the United States, got me thinking about a trajectory from the late 19th century forward. Then a contribution that I made to the Race and Modern Architecture volume, looking at other forms of American architecture, and then briefly to talk about some of the ways that I'm looking today to investigate even further some of the afterlives of this kind of thinking, particularly through an affiliate group that was recently established at the Society of Architectural Historians, and a new podcast that we have to think about the ways that race and architecture come together within the built environment. So in a synthetic sense, if we're thinking about the critical terms that I now use to think about my work, there are two sets of ideas. The first one is this notion of settler colonialism, or the sense that nations like the United States, which purport to be a democracy representative of freedom, liberty, all of the things that we want to see around the world in terms of having a fair and equal relations between all of the citizens of a particular nation state, are actually sort of haunted and veiled and veil a separate reality, which is that America was born as a pro-slavery democracy. And in a sense, all of its history is a history of trying to dig oneself out of the pit that creates for themselves. In addition to that, settler colonialism helps us to understand the relationship between the native or the indigenous subjects that were here in the territory now known as the United States of America before European settlers came over, and the types of political and economic relationships that were established in order to maintain the settler colony that we now know as the United States. And so this particular rubric of ideas has really helped me to be able to articulate some of the inherent paradoxes within American democracy and the ways that our understanding of freedom and liberty has come at the expense of the oppression of certain other groups. And that this is something that we must be able to understand if we're going to try and continue to perfect what democracy can produce, as well as in the field of architecture, we're going to redress some of the kind of social inequalities that have emerged as a result of this kind of mindset. Another set of ideas comes from the field of philosophy, particularly the field of phenomenology. And I'm interested in recent studies in what's called the phenomenology of whiteness. And here are two authors that investigate this field, Sara Ahmed on the right, Linda Martine Alcoff on the left. And what's interesting about this practice is that in distinction to fields like settler colonialism, which tend to look at race through an institutional lens, as a kind of structure, governance structure, that continues to persist into the present. Ahmed and Alcoff look at race and what they call racial embodiment through the lens of everyday life, through the body, and the ways that living continues to reproduce racial identities. So here, at least for me, I have two complementary ways of understanding how race continues to perpetuate itself into the present. One at the institutional level, the other at the level of bodily practice. And so race and space become a very important element of placemaking. And placemaking tends to amplify a lot of the higher order sublimated issues of representation that occurs within architecture. So those two sets of ideas for me have been very useful in trying to determine and figure out how to limn the racial politics of architecture. So if you sort of bear with me as I move through these projects chronologically to give you a sense of how I got from where I was to where I am today, let's talk about building character. So this book is essentially an intellectual history of the racial discourses that were established by proponents of architectural organicism in the 19th century. And what was really interesting to me were what I started to see anyway, as a continued relevance of human body metaphors in modern architectural discourse, even beyond the decline of Vitruvianism in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the rise of new scientific models of bodily productions. And so as the natural sciences start to replace Vitruvianism, this book starts to trace some of the implicit human body metaphors that were occurring during that transitional time period. And a central element of this is the idea of, or the paradigm rather, of organicism. And this is a practice of design and making that modeled and models the architectural form on the generative principles of nature. And within this naturalist framework, race and style, at least in the 19th century with the natural sciences emerging, become parallel categories that start to mirror one another within nature. And so we can see this through a series of images. Here are three. The one on the far left shows us very early studies of typology in the Linnaean tradition, where primarily, because we lack the technology to look down at things in a cellular level, we're understanding things through bodily or physical appearances. So we're literally grouping things that look similar to one another and assuming that there's a kind of natural origin to this formal taxonomy. We do something similar in the late 18th, early 19th century when we're looking at human bodies, particularly as the European world starts to develop nation states and they start to migrate around the world and seeing difference and trying to understand what their relationship is to this difference. In addition, what kinds of systems of exploitation can occur as they create colonies in one area or another. And so we continue this tradition of holding physical taxonomies together, but now the sciences are starting to develop theories about what is internal to the body that's creating these differences. And so there's a notion that starts to emerge that nature itself has a kind of hidden rule set that we have to discover as scientists. And this rule set creates a kind of teleology of form. There's a concept of the human body inside of physical materials and the concept of flora and fauna and the different elements of nature that regulates what it looks like and how it performs functionally in the world. And so modern architects begin to look at and historicize architecture in the same ways. Vernacular architectures are a kind of natural response or a functional response of different groups to the raw materials that are present and the kinds of social and cultural norms that are established within each place. And so within this notion of the unity underlying a variety of forms, architects begin to theorize the historical origins of different regional architectural styles. And this is where we get this notion of vernacular styles somehow being a transparent reflection of the essential qualities and characteristics of a group of people. So there's a deep desire for the rules of nature, the lawfulness of nature, to continue to regulate the appearance of the body, and in parallel, the appearance of the architectures itself. This diagram here is also an interesting one to study because it gives us a sense of how architects, what they saw when they looked at these regional maps of the world. So you might get a sense here of, if you're looking at the top, the types of people at the very top of the diagram, that we're looking at different geographies of the world. And just like we would look at and compare the flora and fauna of these spaces, now we're looking at the animal species of these spaces. And we can see that human beings tend to variate themselves in the same ways that animal species did as well. Now this is a polygenetic map. So it's assuming that not only are we looking at different races of people, but maybe we're also even looking at different species of humans. And that within each species is a kind of inherent cap on the intellectual abilities, the temperaments, the potentials of each group. And that can be mapped geographically as well as biologically. And I really thought it was interesting that beneath the physiognomical representations at the very top of these figures, you also get now the structural or the skeletal representations themselves. And at this time period, you have architects like Viollet-le-Duc, who's very interested in comparative anatomy and physiology, understanding the relationship between the bones of a building, particularly things like Gothic buildings, and the physiognomic expression, or quote unquote, the skin of the building itself. And so now we have a natural precedent for the relationship between the bones determining the skin and the characters of each form within the racial anthropology, the field of racial anthropology. So when designers updated the anthropomorphic metaphors of design in Vitruvian architecture theory with the organic principles of the natural sciences, I argue that race types became a privileged empirical illustration of what this could do in the field of design, especially when we thought about race and style as being a way that things are stylized. So nature develops different races as a form of stylizing human beings. And so we return back to this notion of the Vitruvian man, and here I'm showing you Da Vinci's drawing of the Vitruvian man, and then also we're looking at the caryatid to show us the relationship between the human body itself and its representation in the column orders. The way that we understood the human body at this point in time was through a divine origin, that somehow there was a divine force out there that regulated all of nature like a universal clockwork, and that the precision of the proportions of the body to produce things like squares and circles and proportions itself that can propagate from the part to the whole is something that architecture metaphorically referenced in terms of its notion back to the human body. But when we get to the 19th century, the notion of the human body is now different. Now we're understanding it not as something that God guaranteed per se, but something that nature regulates, regardless of its final cause, whether it's God or something else. And so within this natural universe, this empirical understanding of the natural universe, the propagation of species and the propagation of race types becomes the natural principle by which now European architectural theorists start to understand and reinterpret style. And so implicit in this notion of the column orders, when we no longer have a Vitruvian basis for it, is this idea of the expeciation of different typologies that start to emerge, almost as if they were natural elements within nature. And so I start to see then, as I'm looking and comparing race and style and the ethnographies and the empirical sciences and in architecture, that these conceptual parallels resulted in a set of design strategies that abstracted the principles of nature in ways that personified the behavior of buildings. We start to see buildings as if they are evolving on their own terms, based on their need to accommodate certain functions and based on their need to contextualize and fit within certain geographical contexts. And so the beginnings of architectural autonomy and the idea that the building is an autonomous object, we can see here starting to rehearse itself. And so I'm showing you this diagram, one that was used at the École Polytechnique in France to train engineers to understand how it is that architects, through a design model of architectural typologies, would think about and propagate different formal solutions based on the site conditions and the program and other forms variables that would be input within the design problem itself. And so if you think about it in the frame that I'm setting up for the book, this is actually then, it becomes a simulated form of natural selection that's using architectural history as the means by which one would understand what new species or new type forms were appropriate for each context. We can also understand the naturalism of this way of thinking by looking at plates like this one from Durand in his study of typology, treating different typological samples within architectural history as if they were found specimens in nature, bringing them together, drawing them at the same scale, comparing them to see if there's a kind of underlying universal principle that can be applied or intuited and or deducted, depending on how you go about reasoning this, from what it is that you see within nature. And so, as I mentioned before, then, as we go into these brief description of these chapters that I want to show you, what's really important here is that I see a continuity between the human body metaphors that founded Vitruvianism and the modern architects struggling to move past that by introducing new human body metaphors that are based on the rational sciences. And in architectural discourse today, we don't tend to talk about this time period in this way. So for me, it's a kind of innovation to help us to understand more clearly how race specifically, not just natural metaphors or anthropological metaphors generally, but how race specifically served as a kind of hermeneutical tool for the architect to understand how to create styles that were appropriate for the national groups that they were starting to design for. So I'm trying to show you then conceptually and then through architectural theory and building how racial characters and architectural characters start to be compared to one another. One of the best examples of this is in Gottfried Semper's text Der Stil, or style, where he uses and extends the principles of ethnography to think about the history of material culture for man throughout time. And one of his most famous comparisons is this image you see here, which is the situla, or the Egyptian cult object for religious purposes, and the hydria, which is from the Greek culture. And Semper claimed to be able to identify the essential spiritual characteristics or the governance of the values of the social values and political values of governance that ruled each society by looking at these objects. And he would do so formally. So he made an argument, for example, about the Egyptian situla, that it is primarily organized along a central axis that goes up and down, the y-axis. And it has very limited formal development along the x-axis. So being that it's only along one axis, it seems like it comes from a culture that is more hierarchical in its arrangement. So therefore more backwards oriented, more despotic in character, much more given to worshiping history than thinking about the future. Whereas the Greek hydria seems to be developed along two axes. And because of that, it seems to be the product of a democratic culture where people not only are beholden to hierarchies, but those hierarchies are then spread evenly across a particular culture. And so he would use this kind of formalism to intuit and to read the character of these objects. And what's interesting is that anthropologists were doing the same thing to physiognomic profiles of human beings. So they would look at this is literally where the mugshot comes from. so that the police officer can read the criminality and the profile of a person. That there's this belief that the profile tells you the story of these groups. And so he's reading things about the characters about these racial and ethnic groups just through the forms themselves. And what's interesting is that, and this is a diagram that I produced with a bunch of students as we read through this really dense 600-page book to find some of the timelines that were implicit in the ways that he organized these materials. And so within the section on ceramics, here we can see through the kind of formal analysis that Semper established, the more primitive elements on the left side moving towards the more advanced on the right, and that the material culture of these different groups, national groups and racial and ethnic groups, would somehow be representative of their state of civilization and would constitute a kind of transparent reflection of what that was. So in terms of the overall book then, it's divided into two parts. Part one looks at the Aryan character of Alpine architectures, examining this work through French and German sources. And I'm really interested in the influence specifically of Aryan migration theory on ethnographic reconstructions of vernacular architecture for European nation states. And so this idea, this Aryan migration theory, was this notion that within the Caucasus Mountains, that was the original resting place and home of the Indo-European man, or the Aryan man, who would then migrate down into the plains below, some of whom would go over into what we now know as modern-day India, others would go over into Western Europe and to the north, and that these migrations, which were proven, at least at the time period, through the organic evolution of languages and language groups, so the tracing of mother tongues and sister tongues, that this was somehow help modern architects to trace their own ethnographic pasts back to a kind of central origin. And so I'm looking particularly at the ways that two architects really understood themselves as modern day Aryans and inheritors of this tradition, and trying to reconstitute what it meant to be a modern subject within their respective nation states. So in chapter one, I'm interested in the French architect Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc and his vernacular revival of Aryan character. I use primarily his text, The History of Human Habitation Throughout All Ages, and the design that he created of a modern day Swiss chalet form, which he believed was a primitive vernacular typology that emerged along the French-Swiss border in a key location where Frankish migrations occurred for the primitive French nation state. Chapter 2 looks at the work of Gottfried Semper and his tectonic theory, particularly within style, and the ways that he is tracing the origins, the historical and geographical origins of German character, particularly in a type form that he found in the mountain ranges, that in remote German communities that seem to be tucked away from the modernizational changes occurring within the nation state itself, and then looked at that as a kind of prototype for understanding how he could reverse or simulate the process of vernacular emergence to create a style in the present that would bring together all of the different roots of the German nation state into a kind of proto-style for the present. In part 2, I look at the ways that these ideas, and there are many other ideas. So for example, I could have easily included in part 1 the theories of John Ruskin and his ideas of primitive architectures as they relate to the arts and crafts movement, and how that came over to the United States and influenced certain designers. So chapters 1 and 2 is just a sample, providing a case study by which one can then use that model to study other cultures. And then part 2 looks at the ways that these ideas now migrate to the US and disseminate through the translation of certain organicist texts and theories, and then the invention of new forms of architectural theory that were specific to the United States. And particularly, I'm looking at the ways that within the context of manifest destiny, self-proclaimed movements of American architecture start to substantiate a narrative of national progress that starts with European settlers' migration into the state and the development of a new form of vernacularism that is both primitive or vernacular in the sense of it belonging to an early proto-stage of development within the United States, but also modern in the sense that it is of contemporary relevance to where the nation is going. And so in this section, I'm really interested in the ways that exclusively white definitions of national character were influential in creating 19th century paradigms of American architecture. And at least for me, what was interesting is that when I first entered this project as a person of color and thinking through the lens of Pruitt-Igoe in terms of how the Black body represents the racialized context of the discipline, I was expecting to see lots of discussion of Blackness or African subjects or non-white subjects. And what's interesting to me is that what you really find is a kind of debate over whiteness and what kind of character is going to have in the American context. And so in the late 18th, early 19th, or in the mid 19th to early 20th century, what you get is a kind of vigorous debate between architects situated on the East Coast, those in the Midwest, and then eventually those on the West Coast, in terms of what is the shifting notion of national character that emerges as white settlers move from the East Coast over to the West Coast to fulfill manifest destiny. Chapter 3 looks at the work of Lewis Sullivan, the Irish-American architect, and his physiognomic translations of American character. And I'm going to talk about this in greater detail, so I won't review it as much here. And then chapter 4 looks at the ways that all of these discourses from chapters 1 through 3, in this kind of phase of modern architecture that is really interested in national expression and national developments, is transformed and continued in the international style. And I look at the ways that William Lescaze Americanizes the international style by taking the formal idioms of the International Style exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s and transforms that into one of the first federally funded public housing units in New York City. And what's interesting about this moment is that the public housing that was created through this modern idiom as an expression of what's new in architecture is expressed by William Lescaze as being a New Deal architecture. So something that is absolutely born from American political ideas and progress. And it was primarily designed for white, working class, or what they call the submerged middle class subjects that wanted to be more firmly anchored within the American body politic. And so because Lescaze thinks about public housing, like in a similar way to Catherine Bauer and Lewis Mumford, as an organic expression of mass popular culture, then this form of architecture starts to represent what the white working classes are aspiring to be within the American public. And so I've entitled this chapter When Public Housing Was White. And in a way, it brings me back to this opening image of Pruitt-Igoe, but now through the historical lens, at the time before it is sort of stigmatized as the domestic dwelling places of poor Black Americans. So at this time, it's looked at as a kind of a buoy for white working class and submerged middle class citizens who are looking for social uplift in the kind of post-depression era. And it slowly stops becoming a white typology when we open up the suburbs to white Americans and we give them federal monies to do so. And we abandon the financing and progress of public housing the same ways that we did previously. And so this chapter sort of details that transition. So I'm going to talk to you about just two of the chapters inside, just to give you a sense of how I read the case studies in a closer way. This is chapter 1, Campfires in the Salon, Viollet-le-Duc, and the Modernization of the Aryan Hut. And I look at Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc because he was one of the first theorists to illustrate in parallel, in a very literal way, the relationship between racial characters and architectural characters. And he was looking at and using the tools of ethnography to think about what vernacular typologies might mean in architectural discourse. So if you open his text, you'll see pages like this one, where on the right you get a small image of what he called the Dacius, which was supposed to be a prototypical racial origin for some of the yellow races or Asian races in society. And then that image that I showed you earlier of that TP-like structure is his representation of the vernacular typologies of this particular group. So let's note, there's a racial typology, physiognomically expressed, and then a vernacular typology, physiognomically expressed. And the ways that he would discuss the character of both would oftentimes intersect and merge with one another. What is also interesting about this text is that Viollet-le-Duc himself drew the racial profiles in this text, using the principles that he had learned from modern day ethnography and racial anthropology. And he created a kind of hierarchy, cultural hierarchy, in the very ways that he drew these figures. So very much like the mugshot or physiognomic profile, those figures that were looking to the left in a kind of Latin oriented culture, where one reads from left to right, they're looking backward or toward the past. And those lighter skinned Aryan cultures that are looking to the right are looking toward the future and are future oriented. And then we get certain cultures that he considered to be somewhat stuck in the middle, heavily monitored by historical forces, but also gravitating towards future forces like the Chinese. And depending on the three-quarter turn, you can sort of see in the Mongolian more towards the back as opposed to the Chinese more towards the front. And then at the very bottom right, that's his representation of Semitic peoples, which were considered at this point in time to be non-white. And so they take on a very swarthy kind of physiognomy, looking backward, but somehow still able to produce a kind of interesting hybrid when they're intermarried or intermixed with other white Aryan groups. And then within the text, if we think about the parallels that were emerging between racial characters and architectural characters, we see Viollet-le-Duc actually engaging in a physiognomic transformation of architectures as if they were undergoing a kind of racialization process. And so on the left side, we're looking at an image of the first Aryan hut, which was made out of logs collected from the trees around. But then over time, as the waters from the top of the mountain would rush down the mountainside and come over the top of the house, the Aryans learned to substitute certain timber frame constructions with masonry constructions. And so we get a physiognomic change that better reflects this culture's relationship with its context than a previous primitive example. And this physical transformation would start to occur over the text itself with the merging of different racial groups, which then would result in a hybrid architecture. So over the first 6 chapters, if you look at the top line, looking at the development of the Dacius, and the bottom line, the development of the Aryan man, we can see that at the top, what happens is the Dacius stops migrating from one place to another and becomes an agrarian society, establishing a kind of permanent architecture. Whereas the Aryans, as they move from the mountaintops into the plains below, which is how it was choreographed within Aryan migration theory, they start to migrate. The Aryans conquer the Dacius and produce a hybrid structure that is masonry on the bottom, timber-like on the top. And even more interestingly, the plan of these structures have the exact same arrangement as some of the plans that you find in Rome, in buildings like the House of the Faun. And so Viollet-le-Duc is trying to draw the historical origins of Greek and Roman architectures back to the primitive past, awarding the Aryan for their warrior-like conquests and showing the relationships of non-white groups to this type of progression. In this text, he only represents the non-white groups that have a history or show a form of civilizational development. So he never discusses Native American groups. He never discusses Africans. He never discusses anyone from the Latinx spaces of the world. Only Asians, Jewish cultures, and different forms and permutations of Aryans, because at this point in time, as I was discussing, it's really about the dimensions of whiteness and how they progress. And what's interesting about Viollet-le-Duc is that in his late career, he moves to Lausanne in Switzerland. And he's commissioned to do two things simultaneously: to make a map, a cartographical map of the ancient state of the mountains. And so moving from a modern cartography of this space, he starts to theorize what the primitive or pre-modern state of it was. And then he would take that idea and apply it to architecture. And so this is where he comes into this notion of the chalet typology, dating back to a time when Frankish tribes were migrating between the modern day boundaries of France and Switzerland. And he takes that form and he concretizes it to make a new form for himself. And about a year after he finishes this structure, he paints a mural of what he believes is the primitive state of the Swiss mountain ranges that he can literally see outside of his window, which metaphorically returns him back to the migration sites, the plains of the Aryan men of his past, but then updates it through scientific reasoning and his rational process of design in a new form of architecture that both abides by the laws of nature, but also creates a new space for thinking about the future. And so here are some other slides and a kind of triptych that shows you the extended representation of these mountain ranges. And what I think is interesting is that when you look at this illustration and you look at the fireplace itself, we have a sense of one warming themselves with a fire in the kind of environment itself. And this is a kind of simulation of what it was like for his Aryan ancestors to be out in the wild, making fires on the outside. Even the kind of tent structure that they would use to protect themselves is shown and simulated with the columns here in this space. Chapter 3 talks a little bit about this transition into the American context, and I'm trying to be aware of time here, with Louis Sullivan and his learning of physiognomic theory and how he then architecturalizes this notion of racial character into his work. The origins of this, at least in the US for Sullivan, come from people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, who were both part of the American Transcendentalist movement. Emerson was especially interested in taking this notion of Anglo-Saxon character and using it as a historical root for Anglo-American character. And what was interesting for Sullivan, being an Irishman or part Irish, was that he needed to follow Emerson's logic of exceptional artistic talent and expression of this kind of character to write himself into the history of American arts and letters. And so I show how he tries to emulate Emerson and Whitman's biases towards what stock of whiteness from Western Europe was most likely to develop the nation state into an advanced state that they'd want to have in order to enter modernity, and then to think of himself as a part of those terms. Now, again, if we think about the ways that whiteness and blackness operates in this discourse, blackness is always that bottom layer. It always is situated in a way that keeps the white anchored at the top, and because there's a secure bottom. And so this is one of the things that Walt Whitman says in an op-ed to the Brooklyn Daily Times in 1858. And he's talking about whether whites and blacks can live together in the United States. He says, "Who believes that the whites and blacks can ever amalgamate in America? Or who wishes it to happen? Nature has set an impassable seal against it. Besides, is not America for the whites, and is it not better so? As long as the blacks remain here, how can they become anything like an independent and heroic race? There is no chance for it," it should say. So what's interesting is that as Sullivan is internalizing these ideas, poetically, philosophically, from the American Transcendentalists, he's also learning to create different forms of caricature during his time at the École des Beaux-Arts in France. So on the left is the text or the publication, La Journal Amusant, which would take and satirize different segments of the French population. And two of the illustrations that you would find inside these pages would be something like the large-nosed Jewish businessman or the errant Jew, and at different class scales and hierarchies within the space. And Sullivan would also learn about physiognomy through physiognomic texts that he purchased himself. Here's one by Professor A.E. Willis that he owned in his library, where he learned about the different forms of the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and then the full face as a physiognomic expression of a person's character, which one could then read to understand their internal motivations. And so in his autobiography, he would describe many people in his own space in this way. Here's an example of a description of his business partner, Dankmar Adler, where he's describing his Jewish features. He described his mother's French and German features in a positive sense, and he degraded his father's Irishness using the same physiognomic terms. And he would later then start to read non-organic, such as mountain ranges and architectural forms, through the same physiognomic lens. And so looking at Sullivan's notion of architectural physiognomy, I'm really interested in the ways that this design for the Kehilath Anshe Ma'ariv synagogue in the south side of Chicago changed from his ideal sense of what American architecture should look like, which is really taking a nod from H.H. Richardson's kind of rectilinear and very formal, almost secular civic architectures, and using that to house a Jewish synagogue, versus the final form that it eventually takes, which is what happened on the right side, where the kind of organic wholeness that was present in the original form bifurcates, and you get a kind of masonry base that falls in line with the Richardsonian notion of American civic architectures. And Sullivan really wanted for all religious spaces to become just civic meeting spaces. He was hoping for the eclipse of religious thought as a remnant of feudal Western Europe to enter into a new democratic phase. And then a top portion that is much more representative in terms of its ornament of the secular purposes within this building. What's interesting is that during this time period, you have architectural criticisms being written about this building that really complain that it doesn't look as organically integrated and synthetically integrated as Sullivan's architecture calls for. But I read this slightly differently, not as a failing of Sullivan's original architectural aesthetic, but more so as a kind of opportunistic expression. And opportunistic, I say, because the fate sort of worked against him with the budget and the desires of the client, to actually give us an example of an architecture that is Jewish American in its visual representation, bringing these two elements together in terms of the physiognomic sense that he was writing about, not as a synthetically assimilated subject, but as a hyphenated subject, and one that insists upon that kind of presence in contemporary America. And what's interesting about this particular space is that it eventually moves on from being a Jewish synagogue to a Black Baptist church. And not just any Black Baptist church, but one of the few that gave birth to gospel music. And so the presence of the chorus in the front of the congregation and the ways that it sort of pushes its way further and further into the congregation space, and the closure of certain apertures along the wall and replacement with certain murals of mixed race African subjects. And so here is a view of Jesus Christ sitting with his apostles. And as it was understood by the congregation, it wasn't just white subjects, but it was also mixed race subjects and Black subjects being written into this kind of discourse. And I try and look at the ways that this congregation changed the physiognomy of Sullivan's building. starting with that part that was most representative of his Jewishness at the top, by letting it age and fall away, and then just cladding it very plainly and simply, add elements of African-American character to it that would resonate with them and their own sense of identity as a congregation. Now, unfortunately, this building suffered a cataclysmic fire as they were renovating the building. And as they were trying to rebuild it, there was a debate that emerged between which state of the building should they restore it to. Should it be restored to its origins when Sullivan designed it for the Jewish congregation, or during the state of the building when the gospel music tradition first started to take hold? And the congregation decided on the latter, which actually subverts Sullivan's original notion of character and puts forward a more representative sense of American character that includes African Americans, as opposed to focusing primarily on the boundaries of whiteness in the 19th century. So just very quickly, I want to talk about this text and the essay that I contributed here, where I actually use and progress from a general critique of American architecture as looking at race and style in parallel, to understanding it as a sort of synthetic continuation of what anthropologists and social theorists are calling settler colonial theory. And I investigate the ways that settler colonial narratives were actually legitimized by American architectural forms. And I'm looking at this time period when the International Railroad is first coming together and binding itself across the nation state. And images like this one, where white immigrants are working from the West Coast and the East Coast to move to the Midwest to join the nation as one. And so again, I'm thinking about this as a kind of narrative building moment of, within Manifest Destiny, where white ethnic subjects are making a new kind of American character. What's been written out of this history are the work of Chinese coolies and other non-white subjects in this narrative purposefully to buoy a kind of notion of America as a white space. And it makes me then sort of start to explore the lens that I investigated through building character through the lens of settler colonialism, which, just to give you a very brief definition, is a distinctive type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty in its place. So in the United States, this happened when European settlers came over, took over lands from the indigenous peoples who were here, and not only took their lands, but then literally tried to exterminate them through a genocide, and then stopped short of that and placed them on reservations, which are thought of as now as dependent national sovereignties as opposed to independent sovereignties. And so this literal replacement was eventually replaced by a symbolic replacement, where the native subject in American history is now the Pilgrims who come to the Midwest, which is the heartland of America, and start to establish a new society from virgin territories, from spaces that were unsettled and underdeveloped. And this narrative starts to then build up the narrative of America as a white Christian nation. And so some of the distinguishing characteristics of this idea of American history and politics is that the settler colonists permanently occupy these lands and make themselves natives, and then put in place a system that is never to be replaced. So the settler colonial system is not just an event of the invasive settler community, it's the structure that they put in place to legitimize their rule. And on top of the political substructure that exists, you often also get cultural elements that operate as a soft form of power that legitimizes the settler colonialist narrative of the past. And so this is how I'm reading some of the work of Henry Van Brunt, who moved from the East Coast to the Midwest to build railroad depots, both by exposing the racial narratives and the racial lenses through which the railroad itself was understood, but then also understanding his architecture as a new wave of white cultural nationalism in a material form that comes to replace older forms of European settler culture. One of the things that they did in Kansas City, where he would eventually settle, is they would have a yearly carnival that would make its way through the city. And this was called the Flower Carnival. And so in addition to my narrative or explanation of the white settlers coming to replace the organic cultures of the Native Americans, essentially by mechanizing them. So things like the horses that were used by prairie Indians become the iron horse or the railroad in this space. But then during this particular carnival, what's interesting is that there's an activism that occurs within the white cultural spaces, so that the spaces that were now modernized could go back and remember the primitive origins of the nation state. And so you have white subjects dressing up like Native Americans, dressing up like some of the pilgrims of the town before it became incorporated into the US. And this sense of sort of returning back to the past externalizes the underlying organic rhetoric that fueled this movement. So I try to trace the origins of this idea of the racial ideology of this railroad culture, looking at novels like this one, The Iron Horse, or Life on the Line, and returning to treatises like this one by William Gilpin, looking at something that he called the Cosmopolitan Railway, or an international railroad that would not only stretch across the United States, but would cross over into all of the median continents across the world, going back to Western Europe, which would allow for the Aryan races to use the railroad itself as an infrastructure for colonization. And we can see that he was interested in this racial problem when we look at chapter 7, racial problems as proclivities in this context. And one of the dominant elements of this book is this illustration that folds out, which sort of traces the route of this railroad as it goes around the world through this median zone where the Aryans sort of live, out to what we would now understand at the very base as the global south, as spaces of extraction. And we can see here he points as the center, the Midwest of the United States, as the kind of progressive boundary of Western civilization from Western Europe into the US, now reconnected by railroad and able to exploit the other cultures of the world. This notion of the Iron Horse replacing Native American culture is continuous in our history. We can look at things like William Fox's movie, The Iron Horse, which looks at and interestingly uses a rainbow, which was very important for the Cosmopolitan Railways imagery, to allow for the railroad and the railway itself to cross over native lands and or to proselytize the replacement of the Plains Indians culture with the arrival of the railroad itself. And so when we think about then how this had an influence on Van Brunt's new territory, the reshaping of the land itself, which we see here, the replacement of some of the seaway travel with rail lines coming through the city, embarking itself and embodying itself in large territories within the state. And also the change of architecture culture, where the smaller spaces for railroad depots or railroad stations now become depots. And so this chapter really traces the formal evolution from the primitive types of structures that emulated what was used by white settlers in the early years to the modernist types of structures that Van Brunt would bring to the space, and fitting it into this kind of evolutionary narrative by following Van Brunt's writings during this time period. And then what doesn't find its way into the chapter, but I thought was interesting, is that during these flower festivals, and I'm showing you some images here, we get the kind of activization of some of these modernist structures back to something that harkens back to the natural world, from the automobile itself to the carriage, the horse-drawn carriage. And I did find a quote that shows that Henry Van Brunt's own children, his two twins, were a prominent participants in one of these flower parades during his lifetime. And we also have the presence of Native Americans to round out the primitive cultures that help to bring this space to life. And then this slide goes to show you that right before Van Brunt passes away, he becomes one of the leading citizens to lend their names to the creation of a museum, a historical society, that would revive the memory of these primitive cultures itself and create a timeline up to the modernist present. So all this is just to say that my current mindset of thinking about American architecture through the lens of settler colonialism took many years and many turns and sidesteps, etc. But I'm hoping that it has helped to develop a kind of critical vocabulary by which we can understand things not just from the nation's past and the remote past, but even some of the things in our present moment and some of the ways that contemporary architectures repeat the essentialist thinking patterns of the past. And so in around 2018, 2019, a small group of architectural historians worked with me to establish a set of affiliate groups at the Society of Architectural Historians, one of which was the Race and Architectural History Group, which you can find at this website here. And one of the things that we've established here, in addition to organizing roundtables and discussions at the annual conference, is a podcast, one of which that will feature the latest texts and mine the historical texts that discuss the history of race and architecture in our field, as well as collaborating with other experts and specialists in the humanities to think about how it is that race and architecture come together in the built environment. So there's now one episode up, and in about a week there'll be two up covering these texts that you see here. We'll also sort of be reaching out to folks who are authors of other texts and interviewing them as well. So please look out for that resource as we move forward. And I thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope I didn't go too far into past our agreement, and very much appreciate you staying with me as we talk through this material.